I like this part right here. Come on. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of a new day begun. Let us march on till victory is won.
Welcome, family. Welcome, family. Welcome, family. Singing one of the best songs ever. That was Kirk Franklin. Lift every voice and sing. Hey, thank you so much for being here. This is the 4th episode of the 2nd season of New Church Hacks webinar series. I am your sibling, Terrell L. McTire. I serve as your minister of New Church Strategies in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, the New Church Ministry. FYI, this is being recorded and the playback will be available to you at newchurchhacks.com, where you can find this and other episodes of our digital series, which provides both practical and sometimes peculiar prompts for the church everywhere from start to restart. Today, we are discussing 16 action hacks to attack racism. You can courageously and radically transform yourself, church, and community into an active force for justice and anti-racism. This sin needs to be addressed and destroyed, and we want to help you find ways to do so. Please stay until the end, where I will be giving you 7 totally off-topic but invaluable new church hacks. Also later, you have an opportunity to ask our panelists questions. If you have something that you absolutely want to ask or need to know or inquire of, please put it in the Q&A feature. We are so happy to have you today and want to hear your voice. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up with you after the show. Matter of fact, we're going to jump on Facebook Live immediately after this. So go to the New Church Ministry page on Facebook and follow us or like our page so that we can have you be a part of that conversation. So right after this, about 15 minutes after this webinar, we're going to jump over there. This is an active conversation, which means feel free to share any tips or resources or any comments that you would have in the chat feature over to the side. Matter of fact, I think we want to start by asking you a question. First of all, tell us who you are. We want to know who is in the room, who is at the table, and also answer this question for us. Let's see, I'm going to actually stick it over here in the chat so that you can take a look at it. Please give us any Bible scripture or saying or poem or what have you that helps you deal with the struggles of racism. So tell us who you are, who in the room, your title, anything that you would like to be able to add there and answer this question. How do you deal with racism? How do you handle the struggles that are surrounding it? And what particularly scriptures help you to do so? All right, I want to introduce our panelists for today. First, we have April G. Johnson, who is the Minister of Reconciliation for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada. April identifies as African American. Then we have Mark D. Anderson, who is the President and CEO of the National Benevolent Association. Mark identifies as white. Yvonne Gilmore is the Associate Dean at the Disciples Divinity House. Disciples, the Divinity House of the University of Chicago, and a core trainer with the Reconciliation Ministry for the Christian Church. Yvonne identifies as African American. And again, I'm Terrell L. I'm your conversation leader, and I identify as Black. You will have an opportunity to ask all of us questions towards the end, but don't hold them. If you have anything you want to say or ask regarding racism, go ahead and put that into the Q&A section as we speak. But first, I want to start by asking you a question. Let me jump to the polls. The first poll question we have for you is, when were you first made aware of race? take a few moments to let you kind of think about that question. How far back can you recollect the first time that you were actually aware of this construct called race? We're going to let those come in a little bit, but I'm going to ask April to come on and join the conversation and help us out with your first set of church hacks. Thank you, April.
Thank you, Terrell. Thank you all for joining us. I am hopeful that this conversation will be as fun as it is challenging. And so in answer to the question, when were you first made aware of race? I would say as a child. I could go on, but we have a little short time. Bottom line, I was about 6 or 7, and I was denied with my friends access to the local store in the white neighborhood that I had gone to most of my childhood. And one day we could not get in. And when I went home, my mother had to have the talk with me. So that's when I was first made aware. So what I want to share with you today is I want to couch my comments around the assumption that you want to talk about and you want to do something about disrupting racism. For that, I want to suggest to you that you must then use your voice. So my hacks today will center around how you use your voice for this critical conversation. My first hack: channel your strength and courage to lift your voice. Strength and courage are a product of preparation. The conversation about racism is not just a courageous one, but it is one in which you prepare. None of us intentionally show up for a public speaking engagement or even for a marathon without preparation. Because the conversation about racism is a sustained and ongoing one, we must prepare for the journey, the marathon. It is not a sprint. Strength and courage come from discipline, and the preparation allows you to build the muscle for this sustained engagement. Prepare by listening, learning, reading, watching videos on the history of our nation's racial evolution from narrators that offer critical perspectives, or from non-white historians or literary artists. Watch PBS. Watch PBS, The Power of Illusion. Read Howard Zinn, A People's History of the U.S., or Ibram Kendi, Stamped from the Beginning. A book I read this summer was written in 1932 by Nella Larson. The book is called Passing. It talks about the dysfunction of centering whiteness on everyone. So prepare through listening and learning allows us to develop muscles we'll need for the rough spots in these conversations, the blowback, the fear of saying the wrong thing, the endurance we need to resist the temptation to cut and run. Strength and courage allow you to lift your voice about how you can speak up to disrupt racism. Second hack, ready? Channel your prophetic imagination to share the voice of God. All of us are prophets. It's a shared calling. Use your theological voice to talk about racism, and it will require you that you read the biblical text from the lens or the perspective of the voiceless. Whose voice is silenced? What's happening to them? The prophets of old, Micah and Micah's contemporaries, or the gospel writers attributed to the disciples. They were not heroes of the status quo, nor were they allies of the empire. They were counter-narrative activists. I don't want to give away the punchline or spoiler alert in Luke's parable of the Good Samaritan. But friends, the Good Samaritan is an oxymoron. The Good Samaritan doesn't even have a name. Neither does the victim. The Samaritans were bi and multiracial people relegated to non-valuable real estate, and they were stereotyped as poor and violent people. And yet, Jesus says that this Samaritan was not only compassionate, this Samaritan was wealthy. What if you were to read the parables from a perspective and offered a new narrative, giving the victim in the parable a name? Ahmad, Brianna, George. Channel the voice of God and talk about racism in your pulpits and in your church small groups with creative and prophetic imagination. Third hack, channel your inner child's voice. Know your why. If we're honest, We engage in this conversation about disrupting racism for our children. It's our desire to create a better society for them. And for that reason, I want to suggest that you write a note to your inner child. My mother used to say to me when I had moments of indecision and what were probably then to her trivial dilemmas, she would say to me, if I knew then what I know now, if I knew at your age what I know at this age, maybe I would have the courage to speak up, to stand up, to show up for change for a better world. This is a season of reflection. So why don't we capture our reflection in a note to our child or to our inner child? How would you be different? What would you like someone to have said to you when you were a child to talk about the myth of racism? Would you like to have been read to about racism in your story time? Did you envision a grown-up world where some people mattered and some people were marginalized? Did you learn the tools, how to bridge the gap and to confront and change the narrative that difference does not mean deficiency? Consider where and how you learned about racism and how you might improve on that learning from your inner child. Consider looking at Jane Elliott's brown-eyed, blue-eyed exercise with your child on YouTube. Earlier exposure has been proved that children begin to understand the myth of racism, the reality of racism, and learn the bravery and the responsibility to channel racist behavior. Channel the voice of your inner child. My last hack, channel your angry voice to tap into the voice of accountability. Earlier, I mentioned to you that preparing helps you to prepare for rough spots in the conversation about race. Very often, it will come from you. When you develop the muscle and the fortitude to disrupt racism, you must develop a cadre, a group of people that are accountability partners. Identify who are the truth tellers in your life, particularly on this subject. Who can you call when you need to be reeled in, or when you know what you're about to say might be harmful? Or if you're like me, who can you call after you've done the deed? The conversations and the ongoing work of disrupting racism, be clear, will be disruptive to you. In my role as Minister of Reconciliation, I have an advisory committee, and we developed a mechanism for how we process our anger and our difficult meeting moments, and how we hold each other accountable. So one of the tools that we use in that process, you may have heard of, is used in mental health and is used in recovery circles. It's called the acronym HALT. It means to call a pause, an abrupt or hard stop, and to acknowledge that pain is present. It means to never proceed when you are hungry, when you are angry, when you are lonely or tired. This work produces all of those at some point in the process, so channel your angry voice. Don't silence it. Have accountability partners, and in this case, not accomplices to your anger. So friends, I want to turn you over to a friend of mine, but before that, I want to ask you the next poll question, and that is, when I think of white supremacy culture, I think of A, neo-Nazis, Ku Klux Klan, C, the environment I live in, D, the culture I benefit from, or E, all of the above. Your next speaker is my friend and colleague and compassionate human being, Mark Anderson, President of National Benevolent Association of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
Thanks, April. Good to be with you. First, a word of gratitude to Reverend McTire for this gracious opportunity to join in such an important conversation, and to do it alongside two incredible leaders, Reverends Johnson and Gilmore, that I get to call friends. So you got that first question there that April, or the second question that April suggested, the poll about white supremacy culture. Really, it's almost all the above, in that we are all born into this white supremacy culture. For years, I was lulled into the belief that I was one of the good guys. But I've come to realize, though, that I am swimming in this culture of white supremacy. And every day I have to work to dismantle this culture. Before I get into my hacks, there are a couple of assumptions I'm making as I enter into this conversation today. Many of my comments are specifically directed at my white siblings who are listening and wanting to find ways to dismantle racism. So to this end, here are a few assumptions. If you don't agree with these assumptions, that's okay, but I would invite you to dig deeper in your learning. First, as a white person, you understand that we hold privilege by the very nature of our skin color. Second, racism exists individually and corporately. The civil rights did not solve racism. Racism is institutional and systemic in nature and is prevalent throughout the United States and Canada. The church is not exempt from being a racist institution. My organization that I lead, the National Benevolent Association, is not exempt from being a racist institution. And your congregation and ministries are not exempt from being a racist institution. And my final assumption to share with you is that this is hard work, but it is nowhere near the challenge people of color have had to navigate in their everyday lives for decades. I believe that if true change is to occur, we as white people have to engage in this work deeply. Our siblings of color did not create racism, and it is not their job to solve it. It is our work to do together. I believe you can do this, that we as the church can do this. We must be vigilant and deal with our own white fragility as the conversations get tough. And it is too often the case where we as white people get to choose to walk away. If you need to take a pause, by all means do so. And at the same time, realize our siblings of color never get to take a pause to rest in this white supremacy culture. But I encourage you to fight that urge to give up and to go deeper into this work. Okay, so my hacks. Be responsible for your own work. We white people need to stop relying on people of color to do the work for us. By expecting people of color to lead every conversation, every study about racism, we have once again placed the responsibility on ending racism on the very people who did not create racism and the systems that uphold white supremacy culture. So what does doing our work look like? Read books by experts in the field, watch incredible documentaries, listen to informative podcasts, and engage in hard conversations with other white people on what you are learning. Ensure that the information, however, you are consuming is not white-centered, but truly is reflective of dismantling racism. And yes, by all means, invite trained people of color to help facilitate deeper conversations, but not for free. Pay people of color for their time and willingness to step into spaces that are all too often not safe. So be responsible for your own anti-racism work. It is not the job of people of color to do it for you. Debunk white exceptionalism, the next hack. The belief that I am exempt and I don't need to do anti-racism work. Remember I said earlier, I'm one of the good white people. This attitude is rampant in the church. Come to terms that white people, and especially white Christians, are not exempt from doing this work for the rest of our lives. Next hack, move from charity to justice. The church, you all, are doing incredible work to care for God's people in your communities. I can attest to this as the MBA witnesses every day the various health and social service ministries responding to the call to care for people who are disenfranchised, shut out, and living on the margins. Food pantries, visiting people in prison, health clinics, feeding and community garden programs. And yet, there is more to do. What are you or your ministry doing to get at the root causes of why your outreach even exists? Fighting to change legislation, engaging in advocacy on local, state, provinces, territories, and national levels, is crucial to bring about justice. In the work of Reverend Dr. Dietra Weiss Baker, she references a justice buffet. She talks about this very notion of moving us from just doing charity, but to actually engage in the messy work of justice. This engagement is anti-racism work. So I encourage you not to just do the mercy work that is oftentimes seen as pitying people in poverty and people of color, but to add to your ministry justice work of actually changing the systems that create injustice towards people in poverty and people of color. The next hack, follow people of color. Where in your life are you following people of color as they lead? I have to confess, as I was thinking about this, I never had a person of color as a supervisor or as a pastor. Many white folks and people of color, unfortunately, can say the same thing. So how do we go about changing the fact that we are only following white people? It is important for us to find avenues that allow amplifications of people of color voices, even if their focus isn't on anti-racism work. My board of trustees, who I report to at the MBA, is diverse, with a number of the chairs during my tenure being people of color. We also need to check our privilege space so people of color can be heard. A couple of possibilities is engaging in protest against police violence, oftentimes resulting in the death of Black and brown people. Most of these actions are led by Black and queer people. And support people of color-led organizations, either health and social service ministries and/or advocacy and activism entities. Search out these organizations and support them with your time and money, and then truly follow and engage in their work. My next hack, eliminate white silence. Our silence can be deafening to our siblings of color. Have you heard the phrase, white silence is violence? We must speak up and call people out when we witness racism. And sometimes we have to call people in when they are being silent and possibly in positions of power and not doing anything to change systemic racism. And we must speak from our pulpits about the sin of racism and what we are going to do to dismantle the white supremacy culture. Next hack, anti-racism work is not perfectionism. It is the intention, though, to commit to ongoing learning, to keep showing up, learning, keep doing what is necessary so people of color can live with dignity and equality. I'm going to get things wrong on a daily basis, but it is my job as a white person to keep showing up and doing this work. And then finally, my last hack is commit to anti-racism work. Make a conscious commitment that you and your ministry will engage in this lifelong work of anti-racism. This isn't a one-time training that we get to check the box on being anti-racist. Check. Remember earlier on when I said it's going to be hard work? This is where the rubber meets the road. We have to hit this at the individual, congregational, and institutional levels. And then also, how do you plan to hold yourselves accountable to these commitments? Okay, I believe my time is up, so I get to turn it over to my dear friend, the Reverend Yvonne Gilmore, who is going to bring us home for our time together.
Thank you so much, Mark. It is wonderful to be with all of you. I'm grateful. I also have a poll question. I want to invite you all to answer just actually yes or no. I wonder, has your church ever experienced an identity crisis? Has your church ever experienced an identity crisis? I want to invite you just to respond yes or no. There's a poem. It's a poem entitled "We Wear the Mask" by Paul Laurence Dunbar, 1896. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes, the debt we pay to human guile with tongue and bleeding hearts, we smile and mouth with myriad subtleties. We don't just wear the mask, friends, we share the mask. I see that many of you are responding to my question, as your church had an identity crisis, with yes, because you recognize that indeed we do wear the mask, we share the mask, right? And we depend upon that mask, right? Sometimes to try to hide up from our fear, to try to hide from our uncertainty, our knowing, our unknowing. Indeed, we have had an identity crisis. And it is that crisis that brings us, right, to this present reflection, right, where men and women that were invisible for all kinds of reasons, men and women who were invisible were made visible, and where we get to look again, right, at ourselves. I don't know about you, but racism, when I encounter it sort of head on, and even when I have to wade through subtlety, it makes me question myself. Right? It makes me question my behavior. It makes me question how I'm talking and why people are perceiving. I feel often very confused and disoriented. Right? It is that identity crisis that I hope we can be equipped as we move on to confront. So my first hack, friends, is pick your own cotton. Pick your own cotton. You may recognize immediately, right, that I'm invoking slavery. Pick your own cotton. I'm invoking slavery, and I'm invoking this very purposefully, but I'm also invoking Emily Towns, right, the author of Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil, where she talks about pick your own cotton in this. I want to invite you to study your own margins. Look at your own landscape, look at your own labor, look at your own possibilities. We can't separate, right, our personal piety from our social identity. It was not a choice, right, for men and women whose labor, right, was funding all manner of architecture and really building the foundation of this country, right? They didn't have a choice about being in touch with their own landscape or their own labor. And so too, we have a choice about whether we're going to be in touch with our own landscape or our own labor. But we must, right, do the work. There are folks I encounter in trainings who say, I don't live in urban environment. There aren't other people that don't sort of look like me. If that's true for you, I want to invite you to study your margins, right? Study your background, study your landscape. Maybe your family were Irish immigrants, right? Maybe your family, all of us, somebody related to us had to come over and travel. And so I want to invite you, as a part of picking your own cotton, to study your own margins, study your discomfort and your curiosity. Part of connecting the dots and making sense of the wider public landscape means we have to do some deep digging, right? Because we know justice making is a process. It's not just an event. So want to invite us, right, to discover our own riches. Don't just depend upon the labor of others. Don't just depend upon the labor of others for information about yourself and your own background, but do the work of picking your own cotton. James Baldwin, I've been thinking about him a lot lately, and we've been calling each other brother and sister, right? So my brother Mark introduced me, and my sister April went ahead. I know there are folks who actually don't always like this kind of sibling language. I'm reminded of James Baldwin, though, because he talked about slavery, and he said there was a very practical reason why you would say hello, brother, or hello, sister, post-slavery, and it was because families, right, were separated. They had no choice. So you literally didn't know if you were talking to your brother or your sister. So you said hello, brother, or hello, sister, just as a matter of practice, right? Because you wanted to be in touch with family that you didn't know, right, were a part of the journey. I'm grateful for Baldwin's reminder of this. And he also said that Black church, right, is where people were counseled not to be reconciled to slavery, but to outwit it. As we do this, and I invoke his memory and his name, I want to lift up my second half, right? After you pick your own cotton, I want to invite you to just say church is where we tell the truth. To say that out loud, to say it in church, that church is where we tell the truth. Certainly the scripture, right, tells us you will know the truth and the truth will set you free. But I want you to really practice telling it and actually meaning what you say. Right? That poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, right? We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. We don't always say what we mean. I mean what we say. Sometimes we can be passive aggressive. So we can resist slavery. We can resist racism when we actually practice saying what we mean and meaning what we say. Right? Using liturgy, using songs that in fact tell the truth. Asking earnest questions about scripture. Right? It's only when we get in touch with our bias that we can begin to overcome it. Bias is dangerous, right? When we're not aware of it. Naming biases in the Bible, naming biases in our music, in our wider culture. I know as disciples, right, we say that we speak when the Bible speaks, all right, and we're silent where the Bible is silent, and we practice silence in our wider culture. Friends, I've learned, though, that sometimes people are silent because they don't have language to tell the truth. And so as leaders, as people of faith in the Christian Church of Jesus Christ, I invite us just to say that church is where we tell the truth, and then to really practice, in fact, telling that truth. My next hack, friends, is resist isolation. Resist isolation. You can't do this work alone. I can't do this work alone. Part of why when we talk about a system is composed of multiple parts, and they all have to be working together in order for us to resist systemic racism. Right? We have to do it together. We are not more than our relations. Right? My sisters, my brothers, we must all be a part of this work and gather with others. If I just try to do it on my own, I will be exhausted, and exhausted people cannot change the world. Exhausted people will burn out quickly, will burn out fast. They cannot sustain the process of justice making. So I invite you to resist isolation, gather with others, cultivate. Perhaps you have an accountability journal, right? Maybe you make a goal for yourself around reading. Maybe you make a goal for yourself about being active in the community. Maybe you make a goal for yourself about how you're going to assert your visibility, right? And be less invisible in certain spheres. Hold yourself accountable in a journal. Maybe you have a partner, right? Or you have a friend, or you have a group, an accountability group that you gather together. Find a way, though, to resist isolation. When we do that, right, we're subject to apathy. We're subject to ennui, right? To be sort of the spirit to be out of us, right? Where we don't have energy. But if we will resist isolation and gather, right, with others, then we have a greater possibilities available to us that we can sustain the journey and sustain the process of justice making. Friends, my fourth hack is practice calling in and calling out. Calling in as well as calling out. My guess is that you're pretty familiar with calling out, right? We sometimes have a tendency to correct, whether that's on social media or to correct in our chat sections, right? Like we might even be doing now, right? Where we want to kind of check folks in terms of the language that we use. I refer to sibling language. I've even seen correction, right, about people saying, I don't want to be called, I'm not your sister, or you're not my brother. That doesn't quite work for me, right? Or we named Black or African American or white or other kinds of things. It is important for us, right, to make clear how our self-understanding. It is important for us sometimes to call out injustice. We absolutely have to do that. But when I say I want to practice calling in and calling out, I want to invite you to practice combining challenge with hope. Combine challenge with hope. So that we can shift sometimes from defensiveness to inquiry, right? I want us to practice lifting each other up even as we climb, right? So sometimes that might look like saying, something like, maybe someone makes a joke, or maybe someone says something you don't quite get, and you might just, ask a question. You might ask a question, you might invite them to a gracious, different way of understanding, right? You might, say, can you explain that to me kind of in a different way? But find some way to combine not just the challenge, which I think is the calling out part, but call in by highlighting and lifting up hope and lifting up the grace that is available, and reminding each other, right, that we're on the journey together. Practice calling in and calling out. And then friends, my fifth hack on this journey is that take care of yourself and the gifts of God in your community. Take care of yourself and the gifts of God in your community. So I'm going to lift up a myriad of examples that I've actually seen disciples churches do. I've actually seen disciples do this work. I've seen disciples that built a pool many years ago, right? Because people of different races, different backgrounds could not swim together. And so the region, and it's in Illinois and Wisconsin, right? They got together and they pooled their resources to make a possibility happen that couldn't otherwise have happened, because they wanted to take care of the community in a way that was consistent with their faith. I got a chance to talk with some folks at New Covenant Christian Church, and they opened up and developed a legal aid clinic for criminal justice reform, right? So they have an expungement clinic. They work with lawyers and justices to hold court on Saturday. They host all manner of things for the community as their way of taking care. There are folks that are working on food justice, right, as a part of taking care of the community, because they're concerned about people eating things that are healthy. Take care of yourself and the gifts of God in your community. Racism thrives, right, in conditions of scarcity. Racism thrives when there is negative competition and this sense, right, that we don't quite have enough. The point, right, of anti-racism is not to coerce or push people to do things that they cannot do, right? It's not to use power to do things that they cannot do, but it is, in fact, right, to invite people to the justice making that they can do, to do things that God, in fact, equipped us and is calling us to do. So what is it that you can do to take care of yourself? What is it that your church, you can do to, in fact, take care of the gifts of God in your community? Certainly, historically, our commitments, right, to education, our commitments in medical care and healthcare came out of this commitment to care for the gifts of God in our community. So I invite us indeed, as we wrap up and move forward. That is my final hack. I'm excited about our dialogue together.
Thank you, guys. That was dynamic. Mind blown. These were all such invaluable things that you've shared with us as ways to do. And several people were asking about the resources and the books that you guys have mentioned. You gave us a myriad of great things that we can look into to really understand more about how to overcome this pandemic of racism. So later, we want to make sure that you give them your contact information so that people know how to get a hold of you and you're able to get that hack. And then we will also post some of these resources on the newchurchhacks.com website or landing page. I want to get into some time of Q&A. There's been several questions that have come in, and then I have a few for myself. I want to start by even addressing, and Mark, you're welcome to address this first, or any one of us who have had experience with this answer, but I definitely want to understand what, as a white person, does it even benefit you to be anti-racist? It would seem like the way the system is set up for the benefit of white people, why would a white person want to relinquish themselves of that benefit?
It's a good question, and I probably should have prefaced too that just as you all are not speaking for all African American or Black folks, I'm also not speaking for all white folks. So this is, I think, from my perspective, what keeps coming to my mind is the activist Lilla Watson and her quote. Let me read it to you. "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." So I think the reality is me giving up stuff is recognizing the humanity in the other person, and that to live in this society, to live in this world, and to be, for me, a follower of Christ, that I have to do this work, that I have to be working toward being anti-racist, because your value as a human is important to me.
I'm sorry. I'm having crazy internet issues, and so if I drop out, just keep on talking. Anyone else want to respond to that? We want to hear what you have to say, April. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
This is a new vehicle for me. I just want to briefly say and model what I advocated for before in terms of the rough spots in this conversation. I never want to represent what I think white people should do as not having that lived experience. But what I want to say, what is helpful, is that in terms of what Mark said earlier in his hacks, this debunking this sense of white supremacy is debunking the sense of supremacy, which is a binary. And so the question I had when I interviewed for this position many years ago was, why would white people give up their card, their access? And what I realized, I was functioning in a binary, that we have this sense of doing anti-racism work is win-lose mathematics. Or what I often say is win-lose theology, when really our work is about win-win. So what we only present it is, if you do this work, you lose access, you lose keys to the club. It's either lose or win, and that's a binary. And that's a value that we work very hard to get people to. But we know that the dominant narrative, the only reason why racism exists and oppression exists is because the dominant narrative is either or. And I want to say that it's not about giving up, but it's about, as Yvonne was saying earlier too, about calling in. It's about meeting. It's about meeting in the middle. We don't very often do the hard work of what it means to have a win-win or both and. So we give up something so like the Good Samaritan, but we also gain in terms of changing the narrative and changing the way that we treat each other. So that's all I want to add to that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I just want to jump in and say, right, that anti-racism at its core, it's relational violence, right? It's relational, it's violence to our real relationships with ourselves and with each other, right? Because it's predicated on a lie, right? That at the first, that there's some hierarchy, right, where some people are worthy of some things and others, right, are not. And so for me, it's not a zero-sum game. It isn't what it benefits white people and all people to be anti-racist, right, is to gain themselves, right, is to resist the fragmentation, right, that this movement for wholeness is committed to, right, because you can't see yourself as God intended for you, and I can't see myself as God intended for me, right, in a situation where there's relational violence. And so for me, it's you have the world to gain, as do I, that it should vex us all, and does, right? That's the reality, that we're resisting with violence in our relationships to each other and in our relationship with God when we're anti-racist.
Yeah, I think when we think about the greater relationship, human to human, as the greater relationship of all creation, how God has made us interdependent upon one another, it does not benefit any structure. It's kind of like the scripture say, was the eye better than the ear? So it's just like we all a part of the body. Is really important that we consider each other in that way. And this is one of those times, I think this year was the biggest emphasis that I ever saw on the celebration of Juneteenth, when we talk a lot about in the United States of America about the ending of slavery as law. But are we as a people still impacted by slavery even today?
Absolutely. It's almost a closed-in question. Absolutely, because the reality is we function out of, again, these binary roles. We function out of, so I use the example of watching a Black mother, I'm gonna talk out of my lived experience, chastise their child in a store when they touch something. And then you see white children of the same age touching everything in the store. And so you're like, wow, you know, that woman should probably be chastised for being so hard on her child. Where does that come from? Slavery. She wants to protect her child when her child is sold to another master, to know what to touch and what not to touch, what to do and what not to do to save the child's life. And it has carried over these 4 centuries because we know the danger of allowing our Black children to function in this binary culture as if they are equitable or equal as their white counterparts. That's from slavery.
I would, I echo completely what April has said, and Yvonne are agreeing with that. You can look at multiple systems, right? Many of our institutions, and trace it back to racism. The one that's in the news right now so much is the police and the police departments, and what the history is. I mean, it was people chasing down runaway slaves became the first police, right? And so that DNA, that lineage carries through to our law enforcement today.
Yeah, I was gonna just lift up on that note as well, right? In terms of law enforcement, we know wonderful kind of documentary, right, on Netflix. I can't think of the title right now. 13. That's it. Right, where she talks about, right, it's only after the 13th Amendment, right? There were no loitering laws before that. They did that, and they created, any number of laws so that you could have free labor. And so, the prison industrial complex and the way that prisons, the way that they function, right? The fact that there's way more funding, right, for prisons than, for education, even. Right. These are all a part of the legacy of slavery.
So Terrell is frozen.
Okay.
And I'm trying to read the chat. Thank God, the very busy chat. I'm really excited about that. To see if there are questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Here comes Terrell.
Yeah, actually, I do want to mention, okay, sorry about that, guys. So let me share something personal as well that was a big surprise to me when I started doing this work across the church. The Christian Church Disciples of Christ currently is predominantly white, although there have been tremendous strides towards racial ethnic diversity and triumphs made within our culture. However, most of the time when I'm serving in the community, I'm preaching at churches, I'm visiting churches, things like that. I'm visiting churches where for that day, I am their moment of diversity. And so I have very rarely, and this often is met with surprise, I have very rarely been in one of these environments where I didn't have someone come up to me and make acknowledgement that they have that of my Blackness or that I'm different, and not really have any awareness at all of how what they said with potentially good intentions was microaggressive. And so these microaggressions hit me all the time. I'm hit with this all the time. During this time where racial awareness became very high, I had a lot of people reach out and say, "Hey, how are you doing through this?" And I said, "Well, I didn't always respond, but I thought to myself, this has been my life the whole time I've been alive. How am I doing? This is what I'm conditioned to deal with all the time." But these microaggressions have made me, altogether more sensitive and aware of these things in different ways in places where I don't expect them. So our last question before we jump towards the end of our time today, I just want to get a quick understanding from each of you about this relationship between Christianity and racism. Can a Christian be racist?
Absolutely.
You get all the easy
Another close to your question. I mean, it's a lot of the work that we do, and the beauty of this conversation, I hope, and the conversation that we can't hear from our chat group, is that the beauty of this is that we really get to interrogate our Christianity, our Christology, our theology. Yvonne offered, has your church went through an identity crisis? We have to challenge our identity as Christians and what we learned. I mean, I like to remind myself of how I've evolved in my own Christianity, and to begin to challenge. I think about talking to children, to begin to challenge some of the children's narratives that we got, right? So how do we read race into the to the biblical corpus? And so the way that we learned about the value or the efficacy of the scripture, very often, someone said in the chat, our evangelical tradition is steeped in racism because it, again, offers a binary. Who's the hero of the story? Who's the voiceless in the story? So similarly, of course, it can be racist. Our goal is to continue to evolve as humans evolve, and particularly on this issue of anti-racism.
I was gonna say, I'm noting in the chat that folks are asking for examples. So Terrell, I don't know if you want to say a little more about the example that you first were lifting up. But I just want to sort of name, right, that they pertain, right, to race, but to sex, gender, right, identity, period, right, across the board, that folks can be microaggressive, and it's related. So I think it's common for us to talk about, right, being passive aggressive. And you probably know what that is, right? That similarly, right, microaggressions are sometimes intentional, often unintentional, right? Like everyday comments people make. And then I'll defer back to you, Terrell, if you want to lift up the example that you were explaining.
Well, I think Terrell is frozen. Let me jump in.
Okay.
Question piece as well. Something that we've recently been having some conversation at MBA, working with equity consultants and joining conversation with my other colleagues, is this notion of how does our staff, specifically people of color who are going out into the church, how do we ensure their safety from these microaggressions? And Terrell, you mentioned that sometimes you're the only Black person in a room, which puts you in an unsafe spot frequently, whether intentionally or unintentionally, right? That as white people, we don't see that. We don't see that this is an unsafe spot necessarily for you. So as an organization, we have to look at what are the things that we need to do to try and make things safe for people. And are there times that we need to call people out when microaggressions have taken place, even to the extreme, even if it's gone to the extreme? How do we step up and raise a voice to them?
And one of the ways, I was looking at resources for children, and one of the ways that we address microaggressions is through modeling. So there's a video, I don't need to do it for children, about a trip to the grocery store. And it's Joy DeGruy Leary is in the grocery store, and she's describing being in line with her sister-in-law and herself, and she's checking out, and her sister-in-law goes through it.
I'll say this, that we're going to jump over to Facebook Live here in a few minutes.
Okay. So the bottom line is, Joy's sister-in-law functioned as a model for Joy's 10-year-old daughter when she stuck up for Joy when Joy was checked in the bad checkbook for being a customer at that store, a microaggression, right? But the light-skinned sister-in-law stood up as Joy's 10-year-old daughter is coming apart. Like, what is happening here? So part of addressing microaggressions is having the courage to confront it. And typically, it may not be the person who's being oppressed that has to do that work.
Yeah. We're going to go to Facebook Live in about 20 minutes on the New Church Ministry page. And am I coming across clear? Okay, so please join us there. I'm happy to share some of my experiences. Just real quick, in essence, you know, it's me being made aware of the fact that I'm a different color than the other person in ways that are unnecessary. And so or that there's a demonstration that my color difference has made them all of a sudden uncomfortable, or there's this awareness that they feel like that they have to tell some story about the times that they have experienced people of color, or their best friend is black and things like this, to try to create some type of relationship with me. All of these things are unnecessary, you know, so and they become microaggressive, and they do become harmful. And I have to spend a lot of repair time afterwards through that. It's very, very challenging. I want to thank each of you for your time, for your openness, for your hacks, for all the ways that you have helped us today. I'm going to give us just some closing remarks here for the episode. I do appreciate you being a part, each and every one of you, of this episode today. This is a tough conversation. We must continue to have it. And also, please consider the ways in which you might be able to contribute to the New Church ministry in your region, or partner with a Disciples of Christ church within your community. If you know any potential church planters, anyone who is feeling a calling towards starting a new work, then please send them my way. I'm happy to get to know them better and welcome them into our family. You can get a hold of me or the New Church Ministry team at newchurchministry.org. Information there. I do want to give each one of we have a few minutes left, each one of the presenters an opportunity to say how we can get a hold of you.
You can find me at ddh.uchicago.edu. My email address is there, or I'm on Facebook. Love to hear from you.
Mark.
Also, I'm on Facebook, but check out our website for National Benevolent Association, which is mbacares.org, where my email is. And we're also out on Twitter and Instagram and everything else.
Same here, Facebook, Reconciliation Ministry, and then our website, reconciliationministry, all one word, .org. And Twitter. I'm getting better at that. I guess we're headed.
All right. Thank you guys so much. Okay, so here we are at the end. I do want to really quickly give you an opportunity. Once again, you can see New Church Ministry at Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all of those. Email me at Terrell@newchurchministry.org, or text me at 317-593-5323. That is the quickest way to get a hold of me. I want to give you real quick 7 totally unrelated, or let me say 7 totally off topic New Church hacks on developing a vision. All right. 1, answer the question. Where do you sense God is taking your church into the future? 2, don't develop a vision alone. You need a team of around 8 to 10 leaders to help you do so. 3, employ a facilitator who isn't on your team and can manage the process by helping you define your vision without speaking into the vision. 4, crystallize a single statement that shows the preferred future of your church. 5, make your vision statement bold but realistic. 6, give just the right amount of detail that provides clarity. And 7, when communicating with the congregation, answer 4 key questions. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? When will we arrive? And what are some milestones that we can look at along the journey? Now is the time to develop your collective's vision for the next year or 5. For assistance advancing your church's vision, please email us at info@newchurchministry.org. Thank you again for being with us today. Join us at the after show on Facebook Live to continue the conversation, or we'll see you on September 9th, where we have an episode on exploring the Enneagram. It's going to be fascinating. I want to leave us with a scripture from 1 Peter 4:7-11. It says in the Message Bible, Everything in the world is about to be wrapped up. So take nothing for granted. Stay wide awake in prayer. Most of all, love each other as if your life depended upon it. Love makes up for practically anything. Be quick to give a meal to the hungry, a bed to the homeless cheerfully. Be generous with the different things God gave you, passing them around so that all can get in on it. If words, let it be words. If help, let it be hearty help. That way, God's bright presence will be evident in everything through Jesus. God will get all of the credit as the one mighty in everything, on course to the end of time. God bless you. Thank you for joining us. See you in a few on Facebook.